I first noticed the lights when the sun was folding itself behind the scrub and the sky went a bruised purple. The long road was one straight ribbon of bitumen out of town, endless and indifferent, and my road train ate it without ceremony. Two small lights hung in the rear view, not the diffuse smear of a tail lamp or the steady rectangle of a truck's markers, but twin pinpricks, white and too clean, like eyes that didn't belong to anything sober. At first, I took them for another rig closing the gap. There were trucks everywhere in the day. At dusk, you still expected company. Out here, though, expectations were a dangerous sort of comfort. The rig settled into a rhythm beneath me. The low, patient growl of the prime mover, the way the cab creaked where the trailer flexed, the thin, methodical slap of tires on hot tar. I ran my palm over the steering column and felt the controls, the long line lurch when the road went soft. The lights stayed where they were, distant, then not. Every time I checked the mirrors, they were a hair closer. Not closing as though passing, but closing like they wanted the same space I had. I tried the usual explanations, and failed at each one. A car on the shoulder, a private security rig, another truck with its tail lights braided oddly across the air, each one dissolved under scrutiny. The lights dipped and hovered in a way headlamps did not. They bobbed in the silhouette of fence posts, sliding low across the saltbush, and then pulling up as if they were following the contours of a mind rather than the rules of the road. I kept one ear on the truck and one on the road. On the long road, the little noises grow loud, a cracked window, a fridge unit, your own heartbeat. I'd been a truckie long enough to trust that instinct in pitches like that. If something felt wrong, it probably was. I hauled freight between stations for a living, big clumsy things most people only saw if they drove a homestead lane or ran out of petrol. I moved food, machinery parts, and sometimes pallets of goods that needed discretion. It paid the bills and kept the creditors at bay. It also kept me inside of the only people who still mattered to me when I came home. My family. My brother Mick ran the yard back in town. He managed schedules, hired hands, the customers who paid up front, and the ones who paid in other ways. He was handsome enough in the way men with pressure in them can be, crooked grin, hands that fix things without asking questions, and a temper that could be haloed into charisma or sharpened into menace. Mick had a way of framing things as business and making them personal when it suited him. That was the part that mattered more than anything on a night like this. We had an arrangement that wasn't written down. It never was. I hauled, he handled the rest. Time was a currency in his accounting. Late meant disrupted chains, disgruntled clients, and more importantly, questions that landed on his desk with the weight of consequence. I'd missed runs before, always for good reasons. Blowouts, floods, the kind of mechanical treachery that runs in old rigs, but being delayed on the long road, alone, in the purple, made late into something worse. It made me accountable in ways I didn't want to be. I remembered his last call with the taste of copper at the back of my throat. He'd had that flat patience he used when he wanted me to understand something without making me admit it. "You're precision, I'm rhythm," he said. "Nothing like a threat but everything like one. Stick to your times. Problems out there make work for me at home. We don't need more work." There was a pause then. "And none of your mysteries, you hear me? Not with the line of credit we've got this week." There it was, a ledger that ran through family dinners and unpaid invoices. I kept hauling because Mick's ledgers had weight, friends who depended on paydays, fines that needed rolling, a mortgage on the small place Mum liked. You didn't simply hand those slips back unopened. So I drove, mostly alone, but not without consequence, when the road chewed up minutes and turned them into trouble. That's why a pair of lights behaving like eyes wasn't just eerie, it was dangerous. Delay meant phone calls that started polite and tilted toward sharpness. Delay meant Mick's temper upgraded from confidant to calculator. Standing on the roadside with a busted prime mover was a recipe for something worse than being late. It was a domino that began at the long road and ended with a ledger and one of Mick's quiet, cold questions. I had heard that question once. What the hell happened out there? And the silence I'd given in reply had only sharpened its edges. I had no appetite for repeating that conversation. So I watched the mirrors. I tried to reason the lights away. They were probably reflective markers on cattle grids, steering past fences, maybe a trick of heat and dust and the angle of my mirrors. Maybe some kid with LED torches on the verge. Maybe a plane, except planes moved with a dignified purpose and didn't tilt their beams to match your line. The more I explained, the thinner those explanations felt. The lights came closer in a way that made them impossible to measure. They did odd things I didn't expect. At a crawl near a cattle grid, the lights dropped until they were level with my back bumper, sliding across the scrub like the path of a surveying laser. They'd lift, sit in a tree line for no reason I could identify, and then sheer away toward the horizon as if obeying some private choreography. Once, when I eased off the throttle and coasted into a sag in the road, they split. Two perfectly matched lights angling left and right, framing my trailer in a way that made my skin tighten. I wanted to call Mick then, to tell him someone was tailing me with the polite intent of breaking a promise. But I told myself I wouldn't alarm him. If the problem was nothing, I'd look foolish. If the problem was real, I didn't want to add worry to his Gora ledgers. Under the cab lamps, the dash looked like a control room from a bygone decade. Dials, tape scarring the leather, a CB handset that felt warm in my palm. I thumbed numbers out more than words and played with the knobs. I checked electricals, watching voltages thread their needle. The needle stayed where it should. Engine responded. Gears slipped smoothly through ratios. The truck was as stubborn as I was, reliable until it decided otherwise. Still, the lights insisted. They moved in relation to me, as if they were reading the same map. When I took the wheel left to avoid a patch of rough bitumen, they matched my alignment and stayed at a steady, unnerving distance. When I straightened, they leant in. I found myself measuring distance by what I could see reflected off the chrome of my trailer, seeing two white dots in the periphery of everything. I told Gaz on the CB, more to have a voice in the air than because I expected help. Gaz worked the same run 2 nights over the week, and had a cast-iron laugh that did something to the monotony of the road. He answered in grainy static and the kind of drawl that made everything more manageable. "You good, mate?" he asked. "You sound like you've seen something uglier than a bloke's in-laws." I kept my tone level. "Some lights are dogging me on the long road, don't know what they are." There was a pause, a few clicks as if his hands were in his pockets. "Keep your eyes on the rig, don't slow, eh? Not if you don't have to." His voice was the kind that looked for trouble at the edges and kept it there. "You still got your blinkers?" "Yes." That was useless information. The blinkers didn't tell me why lights wanted my tail. "Don't be a hero, Tommy." He called me Tommy sometimes because he liked the alliteration with his own name. It was affectionate and an anchor I didn't always trust. "I'm not looking for trouble," I said. "You don't get to not look for trouble," Gaz told me. The CB, a thin strip of company, in an otherwise breathing nowhere. "Not on this road. Keep the beam on, keep moving, and if they try anything you just punch it and get clear. Don't stop. Knights bishops move." I would have preferred the comfort of someone who'd been there and come back unscathed. Gaz tried, but the space between his advice and my gut felt like a chasm. The long road had a geometry of its own. At dusk it folded in ways I'd learned to avoid, soft shoulders, wind that behaved like a person with itchy fingers. The lights seemed to exploit that geometry. When Gaz's voice softened and the static took more of the words away, I felt the isolation with a tactile bitterness. There were no other vehicles in sight. The endless scrub swallowed the faintest hint of human life. A fence line flashed past in regular intervals, a metronome of stolen comfort. No farmhouses, no billboards, no intermittent glow from a distant town. I expected the darkness to continue like a steady thing, but it felt like a living thing instead. Patient, appraising. The lights moved with deliberate economy. They mimicked the sweep of my headlights once, then nothing. They learned my pattern, and when they did, they used it like leverage. At one point they simply vanished from the mirrors. One sweep and the white dots were gone, and for a second I thought I'd finally bled into the night like everyone else does. That was the wrong feeling. It wasn't relief but an absence I couldn't measure. Then, much closer than before, like something that had fallen from the black sky and settled in the road just ahead of me, the lights reappeared. They matched the contour of my beams exactly, mirroring my illumination as if someone had set up a second, parallel headlight system on the verge. Where my light painted the road a flat, honest gray, their light sat on top of it, colder, cleaner. I could see them in the low dash mirror now, a reflection within a reflection. They had a quality I couldn't name, too steady, almost clinical, and they drifted in ways headlights didn't, retreating at a whim and reasserting their presence in a place that was inconvenient. I took my foot off the throttle again, and the 2 spots just forward of my bumper settled as if to watch me. The truck's engine downshifted like a throat clearing. I braced on the wheel, Every muscle in me tensed, as if to be measured whether the road was still mine. There was a peculiar sound on the CB then, an odd modulation that didn't match static, like someone rotating the mic away from their mouth and speaking through a pipe. I waited for a voice, but whatever it was faded into a hiss. The lights reacted to it, tilting in a way that suggested ears rather than optics. Whatever was watching me had the unease and curiosity of another intelligence. I told myself, over and over, to do the practical things. Don't get fancied by fear. Keep the speed, watch the dash, check the straps, focus on the job. Mick's ledger loomed behind every practical decision. Late meant questions, and questions meant things that didn't resolve with a handshake. There is a stubbornness in me that has never learned to fold under threats that come from soft voices. But the lights were not a soft voice, they were a deliberate metric of my exposure. So I stayed moving. I let the rig take me forward, throttle steady, eyes on the road. Each time the lights altered their position, behind, ahead, beside, they did it with the kind of intention that made crossing the center line feel foolish. I stayed where I was because I had no appetite for the alternatives. Stopping meant being static and susceptible. Speeding meant courting a different kind of disaster. I spoke into the CB again, something to break the silence more than to expect counsel. "Gaz, they're matching my beams," I said. My voice sounded small in the cab, swallowed by the engine's patient thrum. "Don't they?" he said. "Mate, just keep your head. If they're playing with you, it's either some tourist with a drone, or something more, well, more determined. Either way, don't stop. Not tonight." The road felt suddenly thinner. The boundaries of the world folded inward, so the only things that mattered were the dashboard lights, the passing telegraph stubs, the shadowed thickness of the trees, and the two measuring dots on the horizon. My life for the next few hours, stacked on a chain of little decisions, whether to pull over at the next lay-by, whom to call if things escalated, whether to mention Mick if my choices turned the wrong way. Each decision cast a shadow, as long as the tow line. When the lights mimicked my header beam again, a strange rationality gripped me. If someone wanted to spook me off the road, they could have done it easier. There were less dramatic ways to force a stop if your goal was theft or misdirection. That left the options narrow and ugly. Either someone, or something, was tailing me for a reason that had nothing to do with profit, or I had the misfortune of being the audience to something that hadn't bothered with register or receipt of ownership. Both were corrosive. The CB clicked occasionally with passing traffic, safe calls, voices that had nothing to do with me. For a time the only human presence that mattered was a breath over a plastic microphone, that feeling of being anchored to the rest of the world by a line of radio wave. It was a fragile comfort. The lights twinned my beam and then lifted, going nowhere, staying just outside the polite intrusion of my light. In the mirrors they stayed patient, like predators calculating when curiosity would overwhelm caution. I kept rolling. The long road is a kind of test. It measures what you are willing to endure for a pay packet and for family obligations that are less about kin than the business that feeds them. Mick's ledger was a shadow that followed me, and all the petty costs of entry into his economy, loyalty, punctuality, denial of fear. I told myself I was obeying that ledger because of pragmatism, not because of pressure, and yet the knot in my chest suggested otherwise. The night began to feel like an accounting ledger folded into a landscape. Every second, a debit. Every mile, a possible interest payment. When the lights above the scrub pulsed, perfectly synchronous with the sweep of my own headlights, I had to admit something. Alone in that cab, with the twin white dots inside the mirrors, I was terrified in a way work never prepared me for. Not the animal, waking terror of a blowout at speed, but a preternatural, watchful apprehension that felt like being singled out. I kept my hands where they were, driving on by habit and stubbornness, listening to Gaz's voice like a mantra. For all the rationalizations I could wrap around it, pranks, atmospheric phenomena, wildlife reflections, there was the fact that the lights did not behave by any convention I recognized. They obeyed a different rule set. In the distance the road laced with the slow flash of a railway crossing. My breath fogged briefly against the glass of Cointreau, the driver's window, more from nerves than from cold. The lights moved ahead, then behind, then ahead again, as if they were riding a mental circuit mapped to my axles. I remembered, with the clarity of a ledger line, a run years before that told me why punctuality mattered so much. It was the job after Mum's funeral, the one we'd promised would be clean and on time, because there were people who counted on it, and nobody to step in if we didn't. We were tight on staff and tight on time, and Mick had been sharp that week like a man trying to stop a leak with his hands. The client was a station 2 hours up, an early drop before heat. The boss at the yard had prepped the sheet, and Mick had scribbled notes on margins in his shorthand. "You keep to time," Mick had said, and I carried that weight. That morning, the ute clouded in fog on the wrong corner, and a jack had slipped, and a wheel had rolled, like a loose coin. We were 50 minutes late to a slow-burned morning, and the client had a fit that cost us cred. Mick had taken it on the chin in front of the crew, and then sat me down and talked to me like a man measuring out medicine. "You're a measure man," he'd said then. "If you don't keep to the grid, then everything else starts to wobble." He made me tell him everything that had happened so there would be no mystery for him to fix. He nailed the ledger to the desk like a declaration. Time is money and the rest is distraction. That memory sits inside my chest when I think about the lights. It isn't romantic. It's a small, practical recollection that explains why I drove when other men might have stopped and taken a photograph. Back then, like now, stopping felt like handing power to chance. The roadhouse came up like a promise later that night, a square of neon nailed to an otherwise soft black. It looked like it had been bolted to the dark for longer than I'd been alive. The sign had missing letters, and the clock over the door claimed 2:40 in the morning. Inside it smelled of burnt coffee and radiator glue. I killed the engine, and the absence of the truck's steady rumble felt like the first soft thing to go wrong. The dim light threw a square across my hands on the wheel. For a minute I stared at it the way you stare at something fragile, thinking about how easily it could all unhook. Behind the counter, a woman with a cigarette and a face that had learned to laugh only on certain days, slid me a paper cup and a scolded smile. The place had the small-time economy of the night. A bloke on a stool with a crumpled paper bag, a young couple asleep in a sedan, a man with a cap that said Long Road, and the slow certainty of someone who'd driven it too many times. At the end of the bar sat an old hand with forearms like meat hooks, and a voice that had survived 100 stories. He chewed his coffee like a thing that had to be kept in shape. "You look like you've seen something," he said when I took a stool. He had the rostered patience of a man who'd heard truckies tell the same thing on repeat. "Or you've seen your brother's ledger." I laughed, because the ledger felt like something to laugh at. "Both," I said. "Mostly the ledger." He nodded as if that explained a lot. "Minutes follow trucks," he said, casual as toast. "Been doing it longer than those fluorescent lights out there. You young fellas don't take 'em serious. Old fellas, they know a line when they see it." I wanted to stop him then, to fold my hands and say I was no one to indulge in ghost story banter. But the lights had already tuned the night. I was still hearing the small math of Mick in my head. Late equals cost, so I let him talk. He told the versions like a dealer mixing options. Minutes were lights that hung in the scrub. Small, quick, then far. Sometimes they mimicked headlights. Sometimes they hovered over the road and watched you, he said. They liked the long road, he said, liked people with trailers on cold nights. Sometimes they'd follow, sometimes they'd lead. Some said they were willow, the wisps, misread reflections off a cattle station. Some said miners, lost and trying to find home. Others said they were the land itself, making a private noise to warn or to test. "You got a rig," he said finally. "That's a target of sorts, big iron, bright things. They don't bite, not really, they just see what you do." "You ever seen them?" I asked. He pushed his cap back and looked at the ceiling like he was seeing a replay. "Once," he said, "pulled a bloke out from under a truck. Wasn't much I could do. Lights came and went. When the boys got there, they said the bloke talked about lights that weighed like hands. Old man looked like he was counting, never finished the number." He shrugged. "That's the trouble with us. We make stories out of nothing, and then sell, aim at the counter." His story was small and precise, and didn't lay a hand on what I'd been feeling. It did, though, wire the idea into something older than me. Min. The name made the lights into a thing with a habit, a history. It made my lights less like a disagreeable coincidence, and more like a doorbell sounded by something that had been taught to ring. He told me another variant, quieter, that stuck in my throat. "There was an old station hand once," he said. "Lost his missus years back, and drove himself out till everyone'd written him off, came in one arvo strange and hollow, said they followed him since the night he left her grave. followed and hummed like a clock. He didn't say it loud, but you could hear the ledger in his mouth. Said, "They only come if you've still got unfinished things, son." Don't know if he was right, but he was a man who had seen too many roads to pick a good lie. I left with a second coffee and a receipt that would sit on the dash until morning. The truck felt different when I turned the key, like a thing that was all muscle and had been put on the line to see if I'd flinch. I had the old man's voice in my ear and Mick's ledger in the other. Both were lessons about measurement. Both argued for different outcomes. The lights were waiting for me when I pushed back onto the highway. They didn't need to be patient with fuel, their patience was older. As I merged, they slid into place. One up the road like a pinhead of light, one behind like a pair of pupils. They had an impatience that ran on a different schedule than the clock. The first thing I noticed on leaving was the truck's dash. The voltage gauge ticked low and then held, like someone had exhaled inside the cab. The headlights leaned a shade dimmer than before. The CB hissed lazy static where Gaz's voice should have been. I ran a hand along the wheel and watched the small lit bars of the instrument cluster. A misbehave in the electrics can be innocent, loose terminal, a worn alternator belt. It can also be the prelude to something that leaves you on the shoulder while other drivers pass, and the world keeps doing its small business without you. The alternator light flickered. The radio went to pure white noise. I told myself the route, check the obvious, keep going. I told myself stories. The ledger didn't like interruptions. I coasted to a lay-by with engine ticking, took the hood release, and stepped out into a wind that tasted of dust and the small patience of things that don't care. The cab roof still hummed with residual heat. I checked terminals, shook wires, the battery clamps were tight, the alternator belt looked like it's seen worse. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that explained the feints and flickers. When I slid back into the driver's seat, my hands were dustier and my mouth drier, like I'd been handling something that might leak. The lights took that as permission. They came in, closer now, dipping and rising like a pair of bored hawks. They slid ahead, then behind. The truck's headlamps threw a line down the ribbon of road. The other lights matched it, sometimes exactly, as if they were copying the position of the beams. Once, one of them, odd and closer, seemed to sync with my low beam, and then go out entirely, as if it had been switched off in the hand of a careful operator. I felt that old reflex, check mirrors, check blind spots, assume someone had crewed up a prank with a ute, but there was no vehicle, no chassis in the dark. The light had nothing to hang from. The CB coughed to life when I needed at least. Sputter, half a word from Gaz, then despairing static like a throat clearing. The road's radio frequencies were a long echo, with nothing that sounded like help. The world had shrunk to the white numerals on the dash, and a pair of lights that had decided I was a thing to keep an eye on. I shouldn't have tried to outrun an apparition, but the ledger in my head did not allow me to be late because of fear. It allowed for spills and for breakdowns. Fear would be filed under, avoidable. If I accepted being stayed, I would grant my brother the knowledge that he could frighten me into lateness. That thought tightened my jaw, like a lock. I put the rig into the next gear and drove for speed. The touch came up. The truck responded with the hum I knew, big, patient, like a heartbeat in a chest, big enough to move a small house. The lights accelerated too. They sat back and waited on the margins as if to tease me, then came forward and kept pace like a second heartbeat sinking to mine. It felt choreographed. I could feel the small corrugation through the steering, an old road, new potholes, and I watched the mirrors for a shape that never came. When they moved ahead they were precise, occupying the lane where an oncoming car's headlights would be. They kept a distance that was bone measured, close enough that if something changed, if I slowed at an intersection, they might be upon me. When they fell behind, they matched the trailer's rear lights with surgical fidelity. They were neither predator nor friend, they were an examiner taking notes. I called Gaz again. "Gaz, you there?" The voice that came back was thin and far. "Yeah, Petey, you sound nuts. You on the long road?" Followed, lights, min or whatever. Old bloke gave me a story. Silence on his end. Then, "Mate, slow down. Pull into a yard. Don't be dumb." "I can't." The word stuck. I tasted the shape of my own story. Can't. I had the ledger in my head. It was not a small thing. Late meant something to Mick beyond a phone call. He punished budgets. He punished reputations. He punished livelihoods. I could see his hand, placing an invisible fine on what I feared. "Then stay on the road," Gaz said finally. Don't stop on the shoulder, get to the next lighted spot, keep talking. The lights behaved like they heard the direction and took it as a game. They alternated, one ahead, one behind, and when I changed lanes to pass a slow truck, they split, keeping the same geometry, leaving no room for luck. It felt like being herded by a weather pattern. I pushed harder, testing the driver's mettle instead of the engine. The rig answered in torque and the road seemed to narrow around us. The night air pulled at the trailer and made the curtains shiver. At one point, as if to punctuate the point, one of the lights dove low and came up so close it threw my cab into a lacquered glare. For a second the windshield was a sheet of brightness, and I saw nothing. No outline, no metal, only intense heatless white that made my pupils convulse. I was a hand's breadth from hitting the brake out of reflex, but I kept the throttle steady. The trailer rocked, and a small sound like a thud rolled through the suspension. I'd clipped something. Gravel, a rock. I felt the steering tug. My left mirror swung like a clock hand. Up ahead, a set of reflective strips caught light, and then a living thing tore into the road. Kangaroos move in mobs, their bodies pitched forward in a slow catapult. One of them smashed into the convoy I was threading through. The lights, in their silence, seemed to have found a new sport. To set the scene, I had one choice: brake, and hope the trailer didn't cycle. Swerve and hope there wasn't a bobtail coming the other way. Yank left and risk dropping into the scrub, where a wheel could find soft earth, and the rig would be a vine in the dark. The ledger offered its calculation. Late is costly, sure, but not being dead is cheaper. I hit the anchors. The rig decelerated unevenly, the trailer wanting to push, the sound of load moving forward like a fist inside a throat. The kangaroos bounded and collapsed, and made the road a chaos of legs and fur. One missed my front bumper by a breath, and hit the right side of the trailer with a wet, grinding impact that made the whole rig shudder. Something in the side panel screamed. The trailer skidded. My hands found the wheel like they'd always been where they were supposed to be. There was a moment. A clean slice of time, where I felt every previous mile, every practice course, every small correction I had ever made. And then the world narrowed to the sound of metal and the odor of hot rubber. Behind me, another rig had braked too late. The lights that had been playing changed position, and were now directly behind the slow truck that had been in the lane I just left. A pair of beams flashed like a warning, the trailing driver braked, and there was a metallic cry, then the sickening sense of a jackknife beginning in my mirrors. The trailer's sliders caught, the nose dipped. I threw the rig into a deliberately ugly counteraction, steer into the spin, hit the throttle to pull the tractor forward and realign the beast. It was a maneuver I'd practiced in empty yards, and on quiet roads, when the mind was younger and the body cleaner. It had to be executed in a sliver. The trailer bit and then steadied. A sliver of panic climbed the inside of my chest like a cold ladder. The truck behind me didn't collide, but his proximity made me know that this place had no margin for mistakes. The kangaroos lay twitching in the gutter. Somewhere down the road a light that had been ahead of me flicked and vanished, as if a hand had pulled a plug. The other hovered, unnervingly steady, where my rear sight told me a tail light should be. I sat there breathing fast, the breath tasting like diesel and adrenaline. The CB spat a voice so fractured I couldn't tell if it was a man or just a broken transmission. "You okay? You okay?" Gaz, I realized. Yeah, I lied, because the ledger demanded it. Truck's bruised, skin's torn, we'll make it. There was no one to make look after me. The old man's story felt like a law you couldn't sue. The lights had orchestrated the crossing and the near collision with a precision that had nothing to do with accidents. They had made the night into a test and tried to count my answer. I cleaned my hands on my jeans and watched the mirrors until the front light, one of them, moved and focused like an eye. It drifted slow and then quick, and then somewhere between the two. When it came up beside me, level with the trailer, it threw no shadow. It threw only a cold white that didn't warm the metal. It didn't highlight the flaking paint or the stickers claiming pride of delivery. It only read me. I could have pulled to the shoulder then. Stopped. Opened the door, and walked into the scrub to observe the ground, to find a footprint or a scorch mark. I thought about the ledger, Mick's ledger, and how the numbers would stare back at me if I admitted delay. I thought about the old man's casual warning. I thought about Gaz's thin breath on the line. The air in the cab felt like a glove. The light that hovered beside my trailer tilted slightly, as if to consider the whole rig, and for a second I felt naked in a way the ledger had never allowed. Alone wasn't the word. Alone was a fact with edges. Solitude was a stone you learned to carry. By the time I moved again, it felt like a choice I'd been reluctant to make. I drove on, because to stop was to be measured, and to be measured by the night meant surrendering a different kind of accounting. When I finally found the rhythm again, it wasn't clean. The rig had a tick now, a subtle drift in the steering that needed correction. The trailer had a bruise along its flank, and the skin hummed with a new voice. The lights continued their court, one ahead, one behind, at times flanking like a procession. They seemed to enjoy the choreography, to relish the fact that I had to think, decide. They kept pace, and I kept pace, and the miles folded like an old map. The close call left residue. Sweat dried on my upper lip, and cut into the salt line of my skin. My hands were ragged, where I'd gripped the wheel. My thumb throbbed where my knuckle had struck. The ledger in my head had shifted its calculus ever so slightly. Fear had a small cost, and I had paid it with bruised pride and a dented trailer. But the bruises were honest. They had measure. They had meaning. Right after the spill, for maybe 3 minutes that felt like an hour, the cab became a place of small, detailed work. I killed the engine and sat listening to the cooling metal. I unhooked the trailer lights, access, and checked the wiring with a torch. My hands moved on muscle memory, finding clips, tightening screws, pressing bulbs into sockets that had loosened with the thud. I breathed between actions, counting like a man who always counts his tools. When the trailer light flicked back on, I felt a little of the panic unthread. It wasn't gone, but it was boxed. Outside, the scrub rustled like a thing pretending to be a witness. I walked the verge slowly and looked for fresh tracks. There were the kangaroos, and there was the torn roadside, and then 2 depressions in the clay that were too neat to be an animal's mistake. There were shallow concentric rings, about the width of a palm each, warm under the surface, and rimmed with glassy black flake. I cupped a handful of the dust, and it stuck to my skin like ash but didn't pull to the magnet on my keychain. That last detail unnerved me in a way a monarch of men never could. I photographed the marks, and the picture came back as nothing but a smear on my phone screen. Inside the cab, I sat for a long while with the cab light off, hands on the wheel, and let silence stitch itself back together. There were slow breaths in the radio and nothing else. I put a matchbox and a finger of the dust in my pocket because I am a practical fool and wanted a token. It was small and warm where it lay and felt like proof. Proof is a business I understand. The depot docked me an hour for the damage inspection and another for late arrival. The lads at the yard were efficient with their teasing. Min boy, seen any UFOs lately? Sharp little jabs delivered over lunch and at the tailgate. The foreman asked if I wanted to swap runs. You all right to take the night leg tomorrow? He asked, like the question was hygiene and not a test. Then my brother called. When he spoke, the ledger moved to a different room. He wasn't angry like men get on the phone. He was precise. He asked who'd seen the run, what I'd done to the truck, whether the damage would push up the liability. He asked if the goods were intact. He asked if I was safe. It was a catalogue. When I told him about the lights, he made a sound like a slap, not a noise of surprise, one of impatience. You stopped? He said. You stopped for a story? The question carried with it a long list of consequences he'd seen and dealt with, not just in freight, but in family. He reminded me of payments due and jars that needed to be stocked, and a sister who expected certain things met. We don't need stories filing us like debts. We need deliveries, he said. In his voice I heard the businesses I'd grown into paying my mistakes forward. The work had no room for the ineffable. He didn't threaten. He didn't have to. The ledger did the threatening for him. He told me, quietly, that I needed to be back out tomorrow. He told me to take the night leg. He told me not to be in the passenger seat of the world and let it drive me home. I hated him for 5 seconds, and then I hated him for the rest of the conversation, which was longer. It wasn't the words. It was the implication that my stopping for the lights meant I lacked the backbone to carry what was owed. That stung where Bill sat and respect lived. It touched the thing inside me that had learned to fix things with a few tools and a decision, and to earn money by keeping the road moving. If he was the ledger, then stubbornness was my pen. After the call I sat in silence and let the resentment do its work. I could have spent my wages in cursing him. I could have handed the job back and let him assign another driver. Instead, I tightened my jaw and did the thing I have done my whole life when the night asked a favor. I went out and drove. The next leg was longer, and the lights kept their routine. They alternated positions, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes cutting alongside like a second rig that didn't make noise. I kept my pace honest, my hands over 12 and 3. The truck flinched and hiccuped but held. The powder in my pocket warmed and cooled. At a rest stop, I took it out and let a sliver of dust fall between my fingers. It caught the light and pulsed like a heartbeat. Work consequences were immediate and petty. Payroll reflected the docked hours and the increased maintenance. The boys at the depot told the story the way men tell stories. Exaggerated in one direction to make themselves feel braver, exaggerated in another to make the teller more central. There were jokes. There was the kind of gentle ribbing that hides 100 small punches. It sat on me like the dust. I could have let it bury me, or I could have let it harden into something else. I chose the latter. I let the jokes land and then roll off. I showed up early that week to check my rig. I worked until my shoulders ached, and the grease under my nails matched the color of the road. I answered calls with a neutral voice, and when Mick asked why I'd been out of sorts, I told him nothing he could file. It's possible I sounded like I didn't care. It's possible that my silence aggregated into a different kind of response. I was not going to be seen as soft again, not because I liked being flinty, but because everything I had now depended on a kind of dependability that was paid for in miles. And yet the lights lived in me. In quiet hours between stops, I turned the memory over. At home, a crate of freight sat unpaid, and my daughter's school excursion needed cash. There were people who needed their gas and their cigarettes and their reckonings met. I fed that list to my stubbornness until it was shaped like a roadmap. I wasn't brave for pride. I was persistent because the figures on the ledger had names attached. I went back out on the long road because I had to answer for more than myself. I went because I was tired of being the kind of man who could be jostled into silence by the unknown. I went because my brother had been right in one way. Men who kept moving made less room for stories, but wrong in another. Some questions needed facing, however unanswerable. The final night was raw. Rain was barely a suggestion on the horizon, a high sky bruising that made the stars look washed. The lights kept their routine. They followed. They cut. They flanked. I drove and watched them do it, with a kind of tired admiration. At times I would slow to 30 and let them close until the whole road was a corridor of white, and then I'd throttle and watch them drift away. It was like arguing with a conscience. Every time I tried to pin an explanation, the lights would shift to a different argument. At dawn, the kind of pale hunger that comes with long nights moved in. Colors turned up in the sky like a slow crank. The lights thinned, then the skin of them lost cohesion. One blinked and reformed, and then blinked again, and finally was nothing more than a star. The other faded into the paler road. They didn't flare or make a show. They just waned, as if their theater had closed when the audience could no longer be trusted with the dark. I drove into the wash of morning with the truck's engine a steady voice, and the dust in my pocket like a secret jewel. The freight was intact. The ledger on my phone showed the losses and the hours, the jokes and the ribbing. Mick's calls dried down to the normal grind of business. The depot's men continued their rituals of assessment and appeasement. Nothing changed, and everything did. What I learned fit into small, hard facts. The long road does not owe you an explanation. It demands that you make a choice when it points you toward the unknown. Choices out here are measured differently, less by bravery and more by need. I'd stopped. I'd looked. That was the only honest thing. The lights had taken a measure of me and left me the balance. When I reached the yard and climbed down from the cab, the matchbox sat warm in my palm. I opened it and let the dust sift into my hand. In the wash of daylight, it was an ordinary thing, reddish with flecks of black, nothing alive that the eye could see. I thought about throwing it away, about erasing the night in a single tidy gesture, but I didn't. I thought about showing it to Mick and watching his face while he classified its meaning. The thought of that face was an argument I did not want to hand to him. So I put the powder back into my pocket and walked toward the office. The lads were there, half joking, half reverent. They had done what men do. They altered the story until it sat comfortable in a joke. I let them. I checked the logbooks and signed my name. I took the money, that was rightfully mine, and tucked it under the same hand that had been opened for the matchbox. The ledger updated, and the world continued. At home that night, my daughter asked if I'd had a good trip. She was small enough to believe that roads existed for a moment between stoplights and bedtimes. I considered telling her a tale about tall lights that followed me and a man who met them. Instead, I made tea and hummed something I couldn't name and tucked her in. She judged my story by the way I kissed her forehead and found it sufficient. Some questions will stay filed under other things. Mick was still my brother. Businesslike, strict, moral in a way that suited a ledger. The men at the depot kept their jokes but added a new respect to the ribbing. In the long sweep of bills and deliveries and minor betrayals, we had added one more line to our accounts. The night I'd stopped to look and chosen to drive on. The long road didn't close with a flourish. It closed like a wound that had scabbed, unremarkable, but for the tightness where it healed. I kept the matchbox in the glove box for a while, because there are parts of the night you don't open to others, and there are parts you keep as proof that you did not flinch. The lights had not been explained, and the ledger accepted that. It only wanted to know if you had the nerve to record the moment you stopped and the moment you left. Those nights taught me a kind of accounting I hadn't had before, that the outback measures more than miles. It counted decisions, small and stubborn, and it kept them in place. It asked nothing of sentiment. It only required that you know what you were willing to lose and what you would not. I'd lost a little of my pride, gained a story that men would spin, and kept my wages for my daughter's excursion. That was not a full answer, it was enough. After that night I drove more slowly, in a sense that wasn't about speed. I paid closer attention to engine notes and to the way dusk organized itself. I washed the windscreen with a careful hand and kept the lights wound sharp. I ran through checklists. I recited like prayers, tire pressures, cab lock, radio check. My brother appreciated the ledger these new habits produced. It quieted the questions he asked about my headspace and about my commitment to the job. He liked outcomes you could tabulate, kilometers, turnaround times, missed pickups, and so I gave him the numbers. They calmed him, and, in that calming, I found a pocket of grace I hadn't expected. That grace had a cost. I lost a small part of pride. Not the kind you show off at meals, there was no show in our meals, but the private pride that says you can stare down whatever tries to collar you and walk away with your boots clean. You don't get to keep both clean boots and clean cred. The ledger will take one for the work, the road will take the other. I chose my daughter and the depot over being a man who had to tell a story to feel whole. I learned there are different kinds of courage, and some of them are paid out in slow, boring increments. Mechanics later told me the truck had had a hiccup that night. Nothing dramatic, a relay that misbehaved under a certain load, electronic stuttering when the alternator ran hot. It was the sort of thing the depot fixed and annotated and filed away as routine. But at the time it had felt like an audacious confirmation that the world was conspiring against me, that the lights had a hand in my truck's small rebellion. Men at the yard like to have a cause. A causeless terror is bad business. When the relay was replaced and the notes filed, the fear remained. They told me the truck would be fine, and the ledger agreed. Yet maps and mechanics don't always touch the edges of what you felt. The truck ran plumb fine, and I still had the matchbox. I kept thinking about that near collision, the one where the lights had shifted just as a roux cut the beams, and the road split seconds of danger into something raw and bright. It was the loneliest sort of reckoning because it was orchestrated by chance, and my refusal to stop. If the lights had had intention, it was a malicious one. If they were a weather oddity, they still had chosen to play around a living thing, and I had to steer. The ramification of that forced decision was not merely that I swerved and kept the load, but that I learned exactly how alone I could be. There was no cop to pull up the shoulder, no passerby to offer a torch. There was only the truck and me and the way my hands knew to do the thing I'd practiced in 1,000 safer moments. That night, everything breathed through those hands. After a while, the difficulty of reconciling practice and superstition became its own job. At the depot, I took the calls for the run and scheduled the stops. I listened to the radio and answered when they called my number. I did the run with the same throttle and the same chain of hand movements that would make any given morning look identical. If the world had wanted to be polite to me, it would have rewarded me with the kind of day that satisfies a ledger. Sometimes I got them. A heavy chain went out, and a heavier one came back. I slept, made tea. My daughter said I smelled like diesel, and I couldn't tell whether that was a complaint or a comfort. The truth is, you can keep moving, and the world will be quiet, but the kind of quiet that follows keeps its own sort of watch. I wasn't brave in any epic way. People told me that in casual tones, taps on the shoulder, a grin that hid the fact they wouldn't have done the same. Their admiration was cheap, and I accepted it because men need cheap comforts. What mattered more than any of that was the ledger. How many times I'd put the rig back on the road after checking the wiring, how many nights I'd come home with the tail light fixed and hands that smelled of grease. The ledger didn't celebrate fear or courage, it only wanted to know the result. Mick understood that language. He'd nod at the figures and say, "Keep it tight." I would, because I had to. But inside the ledger collated more than numbers. It took note of the nights you stopped and the nights you drove, and it never stopped reminding you that both were choices that added up. There were long conversations with myself that didn't resemble conversation. I weighed scenarios. Pull over and wait for dawn. Follow the lights for an explanation. Run them to the roadhouse and let someone else decide what it was. In each scenario, the cost was clear and practical. Pull over and you miss the delivery window. Follow, and you risk the load. Run them to the roadhouse and the men might take it as a tall tale or a reason to cut you out of a shift. The ledger's hand in those calculations was silent but steady. You learn to listen to it because it feeds the people you love. You learn to trust it because it keeps the household fed. That's how fear becomes something negotiable. In the quiet evenings after that night when I told the story in small pieces, Mick asked questions with circumspect teeth. He didn't want stories that complicated the account books. He wanted practical answers. When I gave him certainties, he accepted them. When I gave him nothing concrete, he held the pause like a challenge. He'd look at me across the table with that business look and say, simply, "Did you do your job?" It was an attempt to cut the fear down to its useful parts. That question tied me back to duty. I answered by showing up. We argued in the polity of family businesses. He trimmed wages on the pretext of efficiency. I resented it, and argued the ration of hours to pay. He called that distraction. There were warm mornings where we split coffee and kept the invoices tidy. There were afternoons where his voice raised like a red flag because he'd found a discrepancy. Sometimes these fights were about money. Sometimes about pride, mostly about control. The brother who ran the books liked the world to be clear. He liked men to be reliable, like machines. The night I'd stopped and looked, had blurred that line and he'd seen it as a liability. But he never made the ledger ask me to stop telling it to myself. That part was mine. He needed the work done. I needed a compass. The men at the depot didn't forget the story. It was useful to them in a way. It was a story they could turn into something like lottery talk between sets of tires. It made a man interesting for a week. For me, it became a thing I used to explain why I bought new brake pads the week after. It was a thing to mention on a morning when a bloke at the yard needed proof that nighttime anxieties could be cashed in for practical improvements. It was a story that paid off in service stickers and a nod from the mechanic. The matchbox, for all its symbolism, paid in practical ways: a brake check, a new relay. The world accommodated the superstition with Act 2 repairs. But superstition can also be corrosive. For weeks after the event, I felt watched by the road in a manner that changed how I walked through the yard. I would catch myself listening to the hum of refrigeration units, as if they might sing the lights, pattern. I found myself noting the way the horizon swallowed the sun, like someone turning down a big lamp. The more I catalogued the sensations, the less their power diminished. The outback collects small obsessions and keeps them. I was careful not to feed them too often. At home, I grew reluctant to speak in absolutes. My daughter had begun to question the things I promised. "Will you come to my recital?" And I'd found ways to say yes, even when the week looked tight. The ledger again was the mediator. It allowed for yeses when they could be accounted for. I became very good at making allowances. Mick would email me a schedule, and I would cross-check it on a worn map with the matchbox sitting unopened in the glove box like a relic. I learned to be at once pragmatic and apologetic. That might sound like soft contrition, but it was a reconfiguration of priorities. On clear nights, sometimes the light on the horizon would be a line of stars so low they resembled the way the min-min had bobbed at the tree line. Once or twice I would slow to match the memory, the same physical reflex that made me stop on the verge that night, and I would watch for the pattern of a mimic. Nothing repeated. Sometimes nothing repeated because you only think something significant once. Memory insists on embellishment. It asks you to assign meaning to coincidence. I didn't know if the lights had been a trick of air, or lanterns of a lost caravan, or some spectrum of rural static. I only knew what they made me do: stop, and then go on. There's a particular silence the long road keeps, and it is unlike any other silence. It is not empty, it is attentive. You feel as if the road is taking notes the way I had taken notes after that night, calmly, without judgment. That silence holds decisions until you are ready to reconcile them with your life. Sometimes it returns to you the words you've practiced in the dark. Sometimes it brings you nothing. Both outcomes are fair. I learned to bring a good pen. When I drove the run now, my hands kept the wheel as if nothing had ever happened, and as if everything had. There was a steadiness in that double mind. People at the depot pretended to laugh about my story. Mick kept an even eye and a folder. My daughter slept and judged me by kisses. The matchbox in the glove box had lost its fetish and become an object of reference, an artifact to be opened only when I wanted to remember the exact heat of that night. It wouldn't make the lights explanatory. It had never been meant to. It was evidence that I had been there, and that I had chosen the ledger's path after I had weighed the other one. The world accepted that decision. It let me drive again. It let me take the runs that kept the family in line and the depot running. It let me hold my daughter when she woke and cried, and meant that whatever fear had stretched me thin did not break me. Mick continued to be my brother, ornery, exacting, occasionally generous in ways that felt like accounting. We fought and we reconciled in the slow way men who share balance sheets do. The lights didn't appear again. I stopped expecting them to. That absence taught me something that no ledger could teach. It taught me that unknowns sometimes work like a compass rather than a chain. A compass points without explaining the terrain. The outback had shown me a point, a movement, a possibility I could not name. It didn't owe me an explanation. The ledger didn't either, but the ledger would always ask for actions. I had to act. When I finally closed the glove box, it clicked, and the matchbox slid into darkness. I felt relief, because the thing was small and manageable, and because I had turned it into a reminder, not an accusation. I had not flinched in the way my pride insisted I would. Neither had I run towards spectacle. I had done the basic, important work of a man with a child and a job, a series of decisions stitched together. On those nights when the road was pure black and the world seemed to breathe around me, I would press my thumb into the matchbox cover and remember the exact angle the lights had made. The memory was like a line scored on the inside of a box, visible, private, useful. I knew it was mine to carry. I also knew that carrying it did not make me less of a driver, or less of a brother, or less of a man. It merely added nuance. This is the end of a particular story, but not of my runs. The long road keeps going, the depot keeps humming, the ledger keeps its sums. I keep my matchbox. I kept my daughter and the approvals for her school trip. I kept the job because fear isn't a currency in our line of work. Obligations are. We pay in time and effort, and we get back the quiet that allows the house to stand. If you've ever driven the long road at night, you know the silence. Tell me about it below, and if you want more, hit like and subscribe. More stories are coming.